Chapter 4. Chapter 4, we are going to be learning about what we call the garments of the soul. The last 3 chapters that we say, okay, you got 2 souls. What does the soul look like? Well, the godly soul specifically is an actual piece of God above, and it has 10 soul powers. It's important because we're learning the makeup. Because if we're going to tell you, oh, you have to be this Beinoni, you have to be this person who whatever, then you got to know what you're dealing with. You got to know what kind of tools and equipment you've got. That's why we have to go through the whole breakdown of everything. See how everything functions, see all the parts work? Good. Now let's put it all together and let's see what happens when we actually try to use this stuff. Last chapter introduced it to us from the intellectual standpoint of using the intellect to create emotion. Specifically, we're going to use the intellect to create, channel, control emotion. Part of also last chapter is trying to show us not all emotions are created equal, I guess you could say. Because as human beings, we're constantly bombarded. We even bombard ourselves with our emotions. And different things are always going on because everything that happens, according to what the day is, we react to it differently. What we want to try to do is try to get that all under control so it's not just like a bunch of ping pong balls flying all over the place. Or a pinball. We don't want to go through life like that. Also, that doesn't maximize ourselves. We each got our own little cocktail of nature, nurture, etc. And then how that's going to come out is going to depend on what we do for that. What kind of channels we create. What kind of control we create. What kind of grip we get on ourselves. Last chapter is introducing that we can use our minds to get a grip on ourselves. Sure, there's going to be a lot of emotions that are coming at us, but we can use our mind to actually, quote unquote, get a grip on ourselves. Also, if we're not feeling something, we can actually create a feeling. This also to later chapters because we have commandments. You have to love God and you have to fear God. So how can you give someone a commandment for a feeling? General question that always comes up. So it's because you can create feeling. The question is that does this concept only, as in for creating, controlling emotion, only apply to God or does it apply for other things? It does bleed into other things in the sense of Avos Yisrael, for example. So you say, oh, if you love God, then you love who God loves, so then you love your fellow Jew. That's a very nice thing to say, but it's also very hard. It's much easier to love people when you don't know them. It's very easy to love a collective. It's very hard to love individuals, especially because that guy is a weirdo. The whole 32 of that chapter is going to give us much more about it, but anything, if you think about it long enough, definitely in the intellect, you could rearrange where your thoughts have to go. But once you get your mind in the right place, then you could eventually get your emotions in the right place. Maybe it won't be as burny, fiery as for other things. You could apply to almost anything. Almost anything, in Tanya's regard, is anything that you do in your day-to-day, because everything you do in your day-to-day is supposed to be in service to God. Everything that you do is supposed to be in service to God. Even going to work? Yes, even going to work. Even doing this? Yes, even doing that. We're actually going to get to that very soon. This chapter is like 6 and 7 and 8. Everything is supposed to be for God. So yeah, when you say, oh, I have to do my emotions to apply to whatever, yeah, it applies to everything. In this regard, especially because the Chabad approach, it starts with our mind, starts with our intellect. It's so important for us to know that we can be in control. It gets harder for us when we never give it control. If you don't say no to a toddler, they become a spoiled brat. But they don't have to be. They learn to hear no, and they won't necessarily become a spoiled. Doesn't mean they're going to be happy that you said no to them. They're not like, oh, I'm so glad they're saying no to me right now because I know this is really not good for me. They may never get to that, or maybe when they're 15, they're like, oh, probably not 15. Who are we kidding? 25, 35. Oh, I'm glad my parents didn't let me eat a bag of candy corn in one sitting. Okay, so Perek Dal starts. We have 10 soul powers. 3 intellectual soul powers and the 7 emotive ones. Now that we've got our feelings going on, what do we do with it? How do we get that now to the outside world? So we have thought, speech, and action, which are called garments. Why do we call them garments? Like clothing? Because like clothing, they can be put on or taken off at will. As in, we have control over thought, speech, and action. We don't have control as much, and especially the average human who's not tzaddik does not necessarily have control over their soul power in regard to the stage before thought, speech, and action. If you're like, oh, you know what, I need to change my netzach, it's going in the wrong direction, I'm not going to tell you can't, but good luck. Versus if, oh, I have to change machshava dibur ma'aseh, thought, speech, or action, then yeah, that you can change. And that's much more accessible to you to change. And that's much more relevant for you to change. Or not just change, but also control. If you learned time before, it's not new to you to say that, oh, you have to control your thoughts. You know, a lot of people have a hard time with that. Because what? Thoughts are always coming into my mind. Well, yes, they are. Like we said last time, it doesn't mean you have to let them sit there. See, the high schoolers have a hard time with this, especially the 9th graders. But my thoughts aren't harming anyone. What does that have to do with anything? We're not even talking about that, because Tanya's about ourselves. It's a self-help, self-improvement, self-refinement thing. When the thoughts come into your mind, you let them sit there or not. You try to rechannel them in the other direction. That's why the Friedrich Rebbe said, you want to have a Torah thought ready, because it's not just enough to just bump a thought out of your mind. You have to replace it with something, because your mind is always churning. It's always working. So if you don't put something else in there, something will find its way in, and then you're going to start wondering about if you actually put cotton candy in the sky, would it work the same way as a cloud or something? I don't know. You go to weird places if you don't fill your mind with proper stuff. But it's not just enough to push it out. You have to have something to replace it with. In regard to the godly soul, the Nefesh Elokis, it specifically speaks about the way Torah and mitzvahs are used, the way thought, speech, and action do Torah and mitzvahs. So we have machshava would be pardes, which what we'll go through them. Dibur would be verbal study or prayer, and Maisa is the action mitzvahs. In the godly soul, when the soul garments are used as they should be used, they will be part of Torah study for thought, and Torah study also the verbal Torah study for speech, prayer for speech, and action mitzvahs for action. And then what's Pardes? Pardes is an orchard. These are the 4 levels of interpretation of the Torah. Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. Pshat is the basic meaning of the Torah. Remez is hint. Drush is allegory. And Sod is secret. The hinting is like gematria. You know, like the Baal Turim. When you studied Chumash, you had Baal Turim. He was always computing stuff. So the Baal Turim does a lot of gematrias. We'd be interpreting on the Remez level. Drush, that's the Medrash. And then Sod is Kabbalah. Chassidus gives light to all 4. A lot of people think Chassidus is Kabbalah, but it's not. Chassidus gives new meaning to each level of Pardes. It gives new meaning to Pshat. It gives new meaning to Remez, and new meaning to Drush, and new meaning to Sod. It gives new light to each of them. So it's not specifically in any one of those categories because it illuminates all 4 of the categories. Pshat, I mean the basic literal meaning, that's Rashi. It's kind of like a misnomer. You say, oh, it's the basic meaning. And then you learn Rashi, and like, a 5-year-old would ask this question. You're like, which 5-year-olds do you know? Just because it means the literal basic interpretation, it just means it's not going to stuff that's not clearly in the text. Something that's interesting with this is that, we also sort of mentioned this last time, is that when it comes to thought, the Alter Rebbe is usually very specific to say, Kol ma she'efshar lo lahasig, that each person according to what they can understand. Because when it comes to speech and action, we all have the same standards. Some things might be harder for other people. Some people are more generous, so giving tzedakah is easier for them. But that doesn't absolve someone else from giving tzedakah. The mitzvahs of Dibur and Maisa are the same for everybody. Machshava, while we are all meant to study Torah, we recognize that we're all going to study Torah on our level. Not everyone's expected to become the biggest Kabbalist, or not everyone's expected to become the next Baal Term. It's each going to be according to what our capacities are. And it's also because our souls are rooted in a different level of Pardes. You can see that also according to different levels that you're kind of more drawn to. So the expectation is not the same as far as Machshava goes. The expectation is the same for Dibur and Maisa. Also, it would be a progression of what we put in our thought could also eventually lead to speech and action. That's also we want to be careful with thought. It also connects to last time. The things that we're going to put in our mind, it's not a guarantee that they'll come out, but it is a possibility that it could come out. If you're hanging around with people who, maybe you know people like this, who are swearing a lot, or if you're reading stuff that's got a lot of, I know. There are people like this. I know this is very unfamiliar to you guys, but theoretically, if you would know of someone, look, I want to educate you guys, but I don't want to totally shock you. What are the odds that if you're not monitoring yourself, it might come out? Thought is important. Not just because thought could create emotion and all this stuff, but it does lead to speech and action. Where are we going with all this? All of these, either they're expressing or they're going to be impelled by Ava and Yira. Ava and Yira, there's a lot of chapters later on that deal with Ava and Yira. There's a lot of on Ava and Yira. Our 10 soul powers, everything that's on the right side is Ava and everything that's on the left side is Yira. But why are Ava and Yira so important? Because people will not be compelled or impelled to do something unless there is love and fear. There's 248 positive commandments, and they're like the 248 organs of the body. There's a whole parallel thing. The positive commandments can all be achieved through love of God. A lot of people, if you're raised with mitzvahs, so you're going to do a lot of the mitzvahs that you're raised with, whether or not you necessarily feel some deep burning love of God. But if you're looking at especially the mitzvahs that are harder for you to keep, I can sit and explain to you about why this mitzvah is so important, or I could try to strengthen your love of God, and that will help you in doing the mitzvahs that are harder for you to keep. When you have a deep regard for someone or a deep love for them, you want to do stuff for them, even if it's not something that you want to, or even if it's not something that you care for. Your love of them is what pushes you to do for them. Love is all about connection. I want to do for you. I want to spend time with you. The one thing about God is that he's very clear about what he wants from us. If you love me and you want to connect to me, these 248 things that you can do to connect with me. On the opposite side of that, we have Yira. Yira, which is fear. That's the 365 prohibitive commandments, all the thou shalt nots. The 248 thou shalts, and the 365 thou shalt nots. There's a parallel between the 365 limbs and whatever. All of the thou shalt nots, especially if it's not something that I'm doing already, or if I want to take it a deeper level to, it's kind of 2 levels of it. There's a fear of rebelling against him, as in I don't want to mess with the king, but a higher level that there's a shame in the presence of his greatness. Like, I'm such a tiny being before this great God. Who am I to be like, oh, this is what you want? Well, I have another suggestion. I think if you've ever met someone who you really deeply respect, it doesn't have to be someone who's powerful, just someone that you personally very much respect. When you're before them, you're like, oh, great, I don't want to mess anything up. I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to do anything to upset them. I don't want to do anything that's not going to be in line with what this person goes for. If we get that sort of sense, that's where the Yira is coming from. Specifically in Chassidus, it's not a fear of punishment, which you'll see much more in like a Musar kind of approach to things. Better get this done or you're going to burn in hell for it. We don't necessarily take that approach. Not that we don't acknowledge that there's Gehenna waiting for a certain thing, because that's the consequence. You get a stain on your soul, you got to clean it before you go up. But Gehenna's not a destination, it's a way station. It's a wash station. It's a cleansing process. We don't use that as better shape up, you're going to burn in hell. That's not where this fear is rooted in. It's rooted in God as the king and like, oh, don't mess up in front of the king. king. We're not ending the sentence with, or lest thou shalt be punished. It's don't mess up before the king, because if you mess up, then you create a rift between you. And also before the shame in the presence of someone who's so great, wow, the greatness of God, and he's so much, and I'm so small. How can I do something that's against his will? Love is connection. Yira is fear of separation. When you love someone a lot, you're going to want to connect with them. But if you also have fear, awe, respect, that sort of stuff, then you're like, I don't want to mess up this relationship either. Love does not necessarily protect the relationship from being messed up. And how do we know that? Because siblings are always bugging each other. Is love not enough to sustain a relationship? It depends on what you're going for in the relationship. When we're talking about here specifically with God, even though we have a much stronger emphasis on love, and we do like love much more than fear, you actually start to think about it, you realize that yira is still needed. Because yira is the restraint that love does not necessarily provide. Because love is a sense of giving. And giving too much can be not good. So what holds you back? Or what protects something? You have something that's called, this is from the Gemara, you have this idea of a fence that's made out of roses. If you want to protect a property, you could have a fence that's made out of material, you could have a fence that's made out of barbed wire, and you could have a fence that's made out of roses. So why would a fence of roses work? Because a fence of roses, because this is so beautiful, I don't want to ruin it. The not ruining it is still a yira aspect, it's not an ava aspect. So think about it with the siblings. Because the yira is not there as strongly, you'll get on their nerves. You know, you're not as afraid of, because you'll do that. Oh, you don't like when I do this? And you'll do it anyways, because they're your siblings. That's what you do. But you're not going to do that with God if there's fear there. Love is not enough to keep you from, oh, you don't like this? Where do you want my shoes? On your bed? This bed? There's not yira there. But you can't say that's not ava. You love your siblings. We're talking about healthy relationships. But ava is not keeping you from putting your shoe on their bed when you want to just mess with them. Yira would keep you from doing that. But it is specifically not fear of punishment. It was crazy. So I had last week's class on Monday. We were talking about the whole fear of punishment thing, and that's not specifically the Hasidic approach. We rejected when you had back in the day and they'd go around telling everybody you're going to burn in hell. We rejected that. That wasn't where we were coming from. That night, I opened up something to learn it, and the first paragraph was fear of punishment. Then I was like, oh my God, what are you listening to our conversations, God or something? Talk about how fear of punishment, if it keeps someone from sin, then good, use it. That's not what we're going for, because in a way, fear of punishment is self-serving. Because I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be punished. So it says it actually comes from klipas noga. It's not our starting point. Also think about, because if there's no immediate punishment, Mom always says that there was someone who once, the first time I got into that car on Shabbos, I wasn't struck by lightning. So I kept driving on Shabbos. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily do that to that extreme, but that's something that you also kind of risk with fear of punishment. So that's not necessarily also going to be something, oh, no one saw me, so whatever. That's why our sense of fear has to come from a different place. We want to try to channel it differently. Of, you are so important and precious to me, I don't want to ruin it. Think about when you keep something in a glass case, or you keep something very well protected. It's because I don't want to ruin this. That's different than I love this so much. If you love a book so much, you're going to read it all the time. You're going to wear down the pages. And you're fine with that because this shows my love for the book. But let's say if it's an heirloom or something you're going to sell one day at auction for like $1 bazillion, you're not going to do that. We do try to focus more on Ava and the positive, but what we're aiming for, I don't think it could be fully achieved without Yira. Again, because Yira is the protection of I don't want to be separated. Yes, so we have, in the later chapters, yes, we have that. And it's also, there's different levels of fear. The fear of rebelling versus the fear before God's presence. So you have like fear, love. They kind of like stacks. And we're going to one-up it, we're going to one-up it, we're going to one-up it. So they're kind of interdependent, which is kind of like what you were saying, right? That they're kind of, we need them. But also, if you're going to start off from a starting point, your love is not fully there yet. Fear is sometimes a little bit, I don't want to say easier to access, but kind of easier to access. Because if you could actually see God as king, oh, I got to do what the king said. If you could actually get that. Love is much easier to feel and harder to act on in a lot of ways. So it tells us also here now that with the prohibitive commandments, this is how Klipa and Sitracha, they gain nurture through the prohibition. Because God created these negative forces, which is part of the makeup of the world. Choice, all this sort of stuff comes because of it. But he doesn't like to directly feed them. He's not going to give them from his innermost being the way he's going to give to the rest of us. So they're kind of like leeches. They're parasites, Klipa and Sitracha. They kind of leech onto the energies created by negative actions, well, prohibited actions, and that's how they get fattened up on that. So, fun fact for anyone, the next time you're faced with a transgression, just imagine the leeches closing in and then think twice about that. If that imagery works for you. Also, ew. Yes, Mifchinas Acharim goes to the Klipa and Sitracha. Mifchinas Acharim means behind the back, and that's instead of, here, take this gift, you're kind of throwing it of whatever, get it. Well, that's how they get it from God in this indirect way, that this energy is created from our prohibitive, well, because everything comes from God. But it's that God does not directly give them life. God kind of keeps them in existence and just barely surviving. And then if someone does something that's prohibited, they're creating a life force for them to feed off of, instead of letting it just die a slow, withering death. The negative force is there. If you deny it, if you resist temptation, transgression, it has nothing to feed off of. So eventually, it's not going to be worth anything. But when someone does something they're not supposed to do, then it's got something to leech off of and get more life force from. And it's going to stay around now. It's like a vampire, got to feed. Ah, very good. You're skipping ahead. Yes. We have to make love and fear tangible. Because if not, it's not going to stop us from doing something. Or it's not going to make us do something. Now, here's the thing with love and fear. Not to get too caught up in it. Because we're going to return to it, there's two parts to love and fear. There's love and fear as they are commanded. That you have to love the Lord your God. They have to fear God. There's actual commandments of love and fear. And then there's the love and fear that's going to help us in Torah mitzvahs. Technically, it's the same love and fear, two parts to it. Because if we have a choice between trying to deepen our love for God or getting a mitzvah done, we don't sit around and wait for the love to deepen. We get the mitzvah done. Because it doesn't matter where your love is right now, the mitzvah has to be done. Here we're talking about using love and fear as an impetus to do what we're supposed to be doing or to refrain from what we're not supposed to be doing. So how do we make it more tangible? The same way that we've created in the first place. The more we're going to think about it, the more we're going to spend time with God, bring God into our lives, the more we can deepen our love and fear of Him. A lot of people say that they love God, but it's not a deep love that they're speaking about because it doesn't follow through to action. Versus someone that you love very deeply, you will do for them as you can. But a love that doesn't lead to action, it's like missing a connector. How do we deepen love for God? Start every day. Actually try to think about God for like 5 minutes a day. It's not easy to, especially to keep your mind on anyone thing for 5 minutes, especially these days. And see if it doesn't eventually, maybe you'll get like a little stirring the first time, right? Then a little more of a stirring, When you look for God, you're going to find Him. As much as He's hidden from the world, He is there for those who are willing to look. So you're going to look for God, you're going to think about God, you're going to start actively trying to bring God into your life. You will deepen your love and fear. You have to want to do it, and you're going to have to start actually doing something about it. There's no retreat that you go to that solves it. It's something that's a day-to-day contemplation and actually thinking about this. This world that He's created is so beautiful, and the things that He's given me, whatever you want to focus on. This mitzvah that's so beautiful, and God gave it to me, and I connect with Him through it, and whatever pathway works for you that you really connect to is a good starting point. That's very good. How do you get it to sustain itself, the love and the fear? We will get to that, and just so that we can finish up the chapter here, we're going to kind of just give a short answer for it. Number one is that it's part of the fact that we're going to have to break a sweat for it. It's not going to happen automatically. It takes a while to get there. And that comes from the day-to-day of trying to actively bring God into our life. The second thing that we do is that we train ourselves to see God within creation. Right now I'm looking at a computer and you're like, where's God? The computer is a manifestation of God within creation. How can I say that there's any one thing in creation that's not God? Remember we said it's a long shore way. It's hard. It starts with a constant meditation, and eventually, that's like they have the story of the Chassid in his business. He was kind of like signing the receipt. You have da-da-da-da and the total, Sachakol, and he wrote, Eino Mavada, right? There's no one else but God. And everyone's like, what are you doing? You're doing business right now. What do you? So he said, if I'm in the middle of davening and my thoughts start going to the fair, everyone's like, it's okay, whatever. But if I'm in the middle of work and my thoughts stray to God, everyone's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? That's the point. You get yourself to the point where you can't not see God everywhere. And how do you do that? By specifically actively putting God everywhere. It's a process, and it takes a long time. But when you're willing to make it happen, it will become more real and tangible. The same thing when you automatically realize that you don't say, what a coincidence, you're automatically, wow, thanks God for showing me that. Right? Hashgacha pratis. That's a training that we have. That's a training that we do. And then we see like, why is this hashgacha pratis and that's not? You're like, no, that is also hashgacha pratis. And then all of a sudden the word coincidence has no meaning to you anymore. Because you're like, that was God and that's God and this is also God. And this computer is God and this screen is God and this phone is God and everything is God. You have to work. You have to apply the mind and you have to constantly actively do it. And then eventually, how does anyone get faster at running? How does anybody get better at doing anything? Through practice. Through training and practice. That's how we get there. Change your habits. Da-da-da. Yeah, we got to change our God outlook habits. We got to change how our view of God and this, lest anyone call me too religious. I won't say God's name too often. You could be called worse things by better people. Don't worry about it. Someone decides, what are you getting religious on us? Yeah, I am. Okay? Yes, I am. Who said anything about religion either? I'm saying God. I see the truth. Join me. So that's kind of a short answer, but we will get to it much more. It's a very valid question of, it's nice to talk about these things, but we want something that's practical and realistic. The chapter of Tanya now talks about when it comes to the godly soul, thoughts wrapped up in Torah study, speech is all about prayer and Torah study, action about doing the mitzvot. These garments are actually greater in a way than the soul itself. So what is that supposed to mean? Deraisa v'kutra bricha kulachad. God and the Torah are one. Deraisa, mitzvot, deraisa, the Torah. God and the Torah are one. The Rambam describes God as the knower, the knowledge, and the faculty to know. Chapter 2. Everybody else is like, how can you limit God in this regard? Point is, Torah is God's will and the wisdom. It's His essence. This is God's wisdom, as in, do these things. Then so we sit and we explore and try to figure out what all this stuff should be done. And this is God's will. I want you to do a mitzvah. That's God's will. So God's wisdom are part of Him. They're united with Him. which means that when our garments are tied up in doing the wisdom and the will of the Creator, they have actually tapped into something that nothing else can. We have tapped into the wisdom and the will of God, as in we are touching God Himself. That's like lulav and esrog. It's not just, oh, look, I'm holding the citrus fruit and the palm branch. These are the mitzvot of Sukkot. Isn't that so beautiful? Yeah, that is so beautiful. But that esrog, you are actually holding God's will when you hold that esrog. Why? Because God said, take the Amarim, take it and say the bracha, and that's how Sukkot is going to be done. When we do that, this is actually what God wants. I'm actually holding what God wants right now. This is His will in this physical manifestation. When our garments are wrapped up with that, our garments are wrapped up in the wisdom and will of God. That takes us to a very high level. The soul itself is kind of, once it becomes a soul, it's removed from that essence. I don't want to say removed, but it's no longer part of the essence. The way of God's wisdom and will are part of His essence. That's why we have the next pasuk here that says, I have no idea how to pronounce this. Anvisanusu. In the place where you find God's greatness, that's where you find His humility. Because God took His wisdom, which, excuse me, Mr. Einstein, what is the theory of relativity? Remember our 5-year-old and our physicists? Us, that were like, God, I have a question about why did you create 1,200 species of worms? God took His wisdom, which is totally unfathomable, that no thought could comprehend Him, and He compressed it into Torah and mitzvos and all the laws and everything that comes with it, so that our nefesh, ruach, and neshama, our machshava d'Rabbaisa, can actually fulfill it. In the place where you see God's greatest, which Torah is it, the greatest thing of all, there you also see His humility, that God compressed Himself, this great, vast, infinite unknowingness that we can never approach it, and He put it into a Torah that we can actually learn. We can actually study this Torah. Now, you could say, what do you mean we can actually study the Torah? God's Torah is up here, and we are down here, so once the Torah became physical, doesn't that kind of change what's going on? That's why we have the Torah compared to water, versus when you have the comparison of a light ray. Back to our sun analogy, when you have a sun ray that's down here, if you take away the source, the sun ray, it's just like a continuation from the original light. The ray of the sun, you take away the source of it, you have no light ray anymore. But imagine if you have a waterfall. The water at the top of the waterfall is the same water at the bottom of the waterfall. You could take away the waterfall and you still got the water that came down. That's why Torah is compared to it. Because from all the way up there, wherever up there is, the highest dimensions, the highest planes of creation, of spirituality, God took this vast infinite wisdom and He compressed it, not watered it down. Don't confuse the water analogy. He didn't water it down. He squished it all the way down until it could actually be written with ink on parchment for us to study. Now I can actually study this Torah. And when I study this Torah, I am bound up in God's infinity. When I do a mitzvah, I'm bound up in God's essence, in God's wisdom, and God's infinity. That's why we say, 1 hour of repentance and good deeds in this world is greater than all the world to come. In the world to come, the souls get to sit and bask in the Shekhinah, divine light. They're going to the tanning salon. No, not really. They get to sit and just, we're all going to sit in the sun right now. But it's a ray of light that they're delighting in. It's not the actual essence. Down here on this earth, we can actually grasp and tap into God's actual essence. We can actually connect to God's essence and His will through Torah mitzvahs. Our physical, squishy, mushy bodies, or really strong, muscular bodies, our physical bodies, crass, crude, physical is the lowest of all levels. That physical body, the soul in the physical body, can actually grasp God's essence, which the souls in Gan Eden cannot do that. They bask in the light of the divine presence, but they don't tap into the essence. That's something that's done in this world. But what do you mean? We're doing physical stuff. And that's how we have the example of the king. So if you're like, oh, guess what? I met the king today and he gave me a hug. And you're like, wait a second. Was the king wearing robes at that time? Was he wearing a jacket? Doesn't count. What are you, a moron? You're not like, oh wait, you could only give me a hug if you're wearing a t-shirt because less layers equals hug. No, it doesn't. It doesn't matter. Were you wearing a jacket at that time? Oh, so it doesn't count because there were layers there. No, the king gave me a hug. So you can say, oh, how can you say that we were learning Torah, the ink on parchment? It took on a physical form. God's will took on a physical form in an esrog. God's wisdom took on a physical form in a Torah, in a sefer, or whatever it is. All it is like another robe that the king's wearing. You're still hugging. Hugs for the king. Hugs from the king and hugs for the king. That happens in this world, that it's actually like an embrace of the divine that we could tap into. That's a much higher, or you could say deeper level than the souls that are sitting in paradise. Something that no soul can even tap into. Through our machshava d'Rabbaisa, we keep our thought, speech, and action. We get them in the right direction. We get them wrapped up and bound up in Torah study. This is the outcome of it. That we actually get to unite with and tap into and connect with God's essence and His will and His essence. That's chapter 4. Any more questions? But that's also a good example, by the way. We're going to go backward. If you've ever thought about if someone's ever done you a favor before, say thank you when it occurs, but if you take a moment to actually really think about the favor that someone did, and you're like, they didn't have to do it, and they really went out of their way, and you keep thinking about all the circumstances about why that favor was really important or a good thing or something that didn't have to be done that still was done, your gratitude toward them is going to deepen. You're going to feel that. Or whatever other characteristics you could add to that favor. Even if something you expected, but if you'd actually start breaking down the favor, your gratitude really starts to deepen. It becomes visceral. You start to feel it. It links to the feeling, the love, and the fear. It comes back to thinking about it and bringing it in your life. And we know from our own lives that it's true. How do you get yourself worked up about something? You get yourself worked up about something more, you're going to think about it and talk about it. You get worked up about it. All these things are actually things that we already have. And we actually use in our day-to-day life. What we could ideally do, especially as a beginning thing, is transfer that all to here. That if a relationship with God is something that you really want and you're ready to build it, not only we have the tools already, but we use the tools already. We never realize that we've been using the tools that we need to get there. That's also another point for that. Okay, good.